This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. I'm Brian Shrader, agronomist on the east side of the state of Indiana, joined as always by my co-host, Ben Jacob from Southern Indiana, and Carl Joern back from paternity leave. Welcome, Carl.
Thanks, Brian. Happy to be back. As many folks probably know that have gone through this part of the life cycle, it almost feels like vacation when you're at work. And so I'm grateful to be here. Had a very successful delivery, and mom and baby are doing great, but grateful to have a little bit of balance back in the life too, serving the good folks in Indiana and Northeast Illinois.
Sure. Well, Ben, I know the last time that you and I were on the podcast, we talked a little bit about the delay in planting. We had thought maybe things were going to get started in earnest there after Easter. That did obviously not turn out with the rain. And so I guess just quickly from both of you guys, starting with you, Ben, where are we at right now in terms of soil moisture and conditions in your part of the geography?
Yeah, so we're saturated. We're wet. The rainfall that was expected we probably ended up getting twice that amount both times. Now, much like last year, it's been a little bit all over the place as far as where you were geographically, how much you got, but everywhere is pretty saturated. And, we're looking at rain here at least a couple of days this week that should amount to at least another couple inches. And, if the trend stays the same, that'll put us probably closer to 3 or 4 inches out of those rain events. So
sure.
Yeah, we're wet. It's at a standstill right now, but we've had heat and everything's green and purple. So it'd be nice to get a window to actually get out there and get something done now, which is a little bit of a change in my tune here over the past 2 weeks. And let's take it slow. And then, I wish we had some fit fields to go to.
Yeah, you bet. Carl, how about you? I mean, even with the sands and everything, I'm assuming that we're still a few days away from being able to do very much.
Yeah, you're on it, Brian. Same situation as Ben. We went too wet too quickly. So here in the last 10 days or so, we've got 4 inches of rain in a lot of spots, and with another couple inches forecasted here over the next couple of days, it's going to be a while for us up north. Now, that being said, if you get off the sticky clays up by the lake and we miss this rain, there's a chance we could be rolling on some sands here over the weekend or early next week. It just all comes down to if we wind up missing this slug of 2 inches here they're calling for over the next couple of days here.
Okay. Well, my report from the eastern side of the state is not much different than you guys. Probably a little bit more variable in the amount of rain that we got than what you guys did. I think it probably, I've heard some folks that didn't quite get 2 inches. And I've had guys, Carl, very close to your 4 inches. I was at, I think, 3.2 over that course of that rainfall at my own house. And so obviously with our clay soils, we're a ways off. Even without rain this week, it would be sometime next week, I would say, that we could even consider doing any kind of field activity. And Ben, to your point, things are very green and very purple in my neighborhood. A lot of purple dead nettle. Last week, it was almost like someone flipped a switch on things. And so,
hey, I've got a thought that's been burning in my pocket. If you guys don't mind me, it's been weeks since I've been able to get some Pioneer Agronomy podcast takes off here. So with that green and purple situation, Brian, you said you got a whole flush of purple dead nettle. Did you know that in greenhouse studies that soybean cyst nematodes will reproduce just as well, if not better, on purple dead nettle? So they could be more aptly named purple dead nettle cyst nematodes as opposed to soybean cyst nematodes?
That would be great. It still wouldn't help us much. I actually had a customer meeting this morning. We talked a great deal about soybean cyst nematode, and one of my pitches was for the idea that perhaps maybe dicamba 2,4-D in the fall is a good first step, specifically because of purple dead nettle. I can recall being an agronomist in Ohio when a lot of that work came out, and we talked a lot about that, Carl, just because there was so much purple dead nettle in that geography that I worked when I was in Ohio. So yes, I unfortunately did know that was an alternate host, and a very good one at that. So Yeah.
You bet.
Well, guys, we are recording the podcast on April the 9th. And this just a day removed from the solar eclipse. And I wanted to talk about solar radiation today as a nice connection. But I think, if nothing else, just for the opportunity to record this, let's talk just briefly about our experiences yesterday with the eclipse and the time in totality. Before we started recording, we talked a bit about it, but it I guess was significantly more interesting than I expected. I will say personally, I did not give the eclipse much ado, as they would say. I was surprised that so many folks were traveling. I had family members, in full disclosure, that came to this part of the world because we were in the totality and they were not. But I would be really curious just to have a conversation point here about the eclipse and your guys' thoughts. And Carl, let's maybe start with you. What were your thoughts? Where were you at? How did you experience the eclipse?
Sure. So, Brian, I was awfully excited about the eclipse. I'm one of those people that gets jazzed about this type of stuff. And 5 years ago, or heck, maybe it's been even longer, maybe it was 7 years ago, when the eclipse came through the middle part of the country, we were living in Kansas City at the time, and so we got to take part in that. Now, overcast day, so it wasn't as cool as what one had hoped. But here in Lafayette, we were just north of the path of totality. So when they tell you, like, the difference between 99% and 100% coverage of the sun is basically night and day, it is true. I mean, you got to experience part of it. It almost felt as though there was a storm front coming in. You know, you could see things darkening above the horizon. But beyond that, it got a little cool. And you did notice the wildlife around. The birds started to sing, you know, maybe their evening songs, and then it paused and got a little quiet. I can say the rest of the wildlife at my house had all three kids out, had my mother and mother-in-law over, and we really had a lot of fun with it. My mom, Sandy, brought over all sorts of stuff for us to, you know, consume, crescent rolls because of the crescent shape that would be part of the moon, things of that nature. Oreos, you know, the black and the white that you'd see and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So the kids got a kick out of it. If you can imagine trying to put solar shade glasses on a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and have them look up at the sun, it went exactly as you assumed it would. So,
Okay.
But to answer your question, it was very cool, very grateful to be part of that experience. Would have been even cooler had we been in totality. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the folks that were there, because that's you too.
Yeah. So, Ben, how long was your time in totality yesterday? Because I think you may have been better than we were.
We were just shy of 4 minutes. I think 3:53 was the official time on it.
Okay.
So,
we were just over 2 minutes here. I think 2 minutes and 5 seconds or so. But I knew that you would be a little bit longer. So, having been in totality for 4 minutes, what was your experience? What was your thought with the eclipse?
well, I think you guys both made a point, Brian, you leading up to it, and then Carl made the key one for me. I was not particularly excited about being in the path of totality. And I didn't necessarily understand all the gas stations and Walmart and little hole in the wall restaurants that, you know, are selling T-shirts and everything that for this event. But the point that Carl made about the difference between 99% and 100% is absolutely true. You know, it went from being a little bit hazy. Carl mentioned sunset appearing like dusk before dusk, and that's true, but that it just changes instantly, and you go from light to dark. You know, one of the odder things is I live on a state highway, and you know, the eclipse sets a little bit of an eerie tone altogether. But one of the odder things was about 45 minutes of almost no traffic down the state highway.
Okay.
So I'm sure this has been published in a lot of articles leading up to the eclipse, Brian, but you know, I have an affinity for history in my spare time, particularly ancient history. And so I was familiar with the Battle of Eclipse, or the Battle of the Halsis River. And for those of you who aren't as big a nerd as me, Herodotus is the first historian, right? That's what he's called, but he's really more of a chronicler, and he's telling a story for an audience at the time. But the Battle of the Eclipse was between the Lydians and the Medes and what would now be Turkey in 585 BC. And so I was trying to think through this. This is allegedly the first eclipse that was predicted to some people, according again to our friend Herodotus. But the result of this was peace of a 6-year war, that as the battle is heating up, then the eclipse happens, and both the Lydians and the Medes decide this is it. Let's agree to some peace terms. Let's arrange some marriages. And I'm not going to say it was an enduring peace, because that part of the world in that time, it never was, but it was interesting. I tried to think through that as I know this is coming. I've never seen it before, and apply what that must have been like through most of history whenever that occurred and the sun just goes away. Because again, it was shocking that 99%, it looks a little eerie, but the sun is still there and still looks like the sun. It still looks like a circle without, any protective eyewear. So all around, it was a really interesting experience. I'm glad I happened to be in the path, because otherwise I would not have traveled to see it. And glad that I got to experience it.
Yeah, my thoughts are very much the same, Ben. I was amazed. It is a very interesting thing to me, and partially why I think today's topic is of value, talking about solar radiation. But the difference from, as you say, the 100% or the totality at even 97%, there was still a lot of light there. You could function very well. And then at 100%, the dawn to dusk lights go off, or come on, excuse me. All of those things happen, just a completely different atmosphere. And I'm like you, I'm glad that I was able to experience it, because I would not have traveled for it at all. I was not excited. I thought everybody was losing their mind for absolutely no reason. And sounds like in some parts of the world, traffic was a major issue. And so just worth, I think, recording. But it also helps us pivot a little bit today to the topic that I thought was worthwhile, and that's to talk about solar radiation and the importance of it. A topic that we visited a couple different times back last summer, when we talked about solar radiation around the haze and the wildfires and things like that. Certainly just as important, maybe you could make an argument more important than water and nutrients to crop development, certainly. I think the other thing, we talk a lot about the light, but the heat related to that, obviously in connection with corn and growing degree units. And I think one of the things that came out of yesterday for me that was an interesting thing was the temperature difference between the 90, let's say 50%, because I could feel it going down. And as the weather nerd, I had my Davis weather station up, and I was actually watching the temperature kind of crank down. And so we obviously know that there is some relationship there between solar radiation and quote unquote heat, thermal heat as well. And that was evident as well. And so I guess let's just kind of start this off. I'm curious, twofold, I guess, in terms of the first question of the day. One, what's your experience been in those situations where we've had limited light in the past, whether that was last summer or other times? I know, Ben, you've got some experience with a sales rep down south that's done some shade cloth work before, actually a guest on the podcast a few years ago. And then also, I guess, how do we talk about solar radiation in a way that makes sense for folks to kind of understand what's going on and why it's so important? And so I'll just kind of throw that ball up and let somebody run with it.
Yeah, I'll try to not chase too many squirrels here as I'm getting my thoughts in order. But the study that you referenced, I think is key for me to really understanding the impact that solar radiation truly has, because it's not something that shows up on our weather app in a day-to-day. You can't, it's not accessible for most people to say, well, we're tracking, this many units behind on solar radiation. Whereas heat, we know if we're ahead, we know if we're behind, and rain, kind of the same thing. So there's not a real good way to kind of, for me anyway, to kind of have that in front of me day to day without seeking that information out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think as a starting point, that study that was done at Rosedale with the shade cloth, it was done with the 70% cloth. So 70% of the solar radiation was blocked out, which would be the equivalent of a rainy day, roughly. So we're not going to see that day in and day out. But what they did was they left it for roughly 2 weeks on various growth stages, starting leading up to tassel. For those that don't recall or haven't listened about this before, and carrying that all the way through maturity to look at yield impact and plant impact. And the visuals of it were quite striking. There is a write-up on it that is online and has been published in the agronomy research books that we've mentioned quite a few times, that have some really compelling pictures in them. But I think for me, the biggest thing that stood out was internode length just shortening quite a bit leading up to it. Obviously, there were big yield impacts ranging, depending on the timing, from 15 to 80% plus. So with the most significant being at flowering, with basically complete pollination failure. The other thing that really stood out to me, and I think this is one of the more applicable considerations when it comes to management and understanding the impact that solar radiation is having on us, is as we got later into grain fill, that shade cloth had a huge impact on stalk integrity. Right? So not as big of a yield impact as what it did at flowering, but the stalks were absolute garbage, and that was especially true with R4, R5 covering it in that time frame, where there was a yield reduction for sure, but the stalk reduction is the one that stands out to me. And I try to think back again. This isn't recorded real well, but there have been stalk issues in my area that were just kind of unexpected sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
A product that I wouldn't expect it from, or from an event that I wouldn't expect it from. And, one of the ways I'm trying to think about solar radiation is if we can track it better to try and explain, what has happened in the field. Unfortunately, from a management standpoint, it's not all that applicable on corn, and we can get into maybe some things on beans in a little bit. But Brian, I don't even know if I touched on either of your questions there, but
no, I definitely think you did. We will link the study that Ben is talking about from the Pioneer website, pioneer.com. We will make sure that goes in the show notes for anybody that wants to see that. There's some really great photographs of some ears that were taken from one of our former colleagues who kind of stewarded this through, Dan Emmert. Some of you will remember we had on in the past. And so Dan did a lot of this work down there as well. I do want to reiterate one thing that Ben shared, though, that I think is very important. Ben shared that there was an 82% yield loss with this 70% shade cover from VT to R1. So during the flowering time frame, I think there's also an additive effect here sometimes. You are at 70%, you're simulating very heavy cloud cover and probably would typically have precipitation with this kind of level as well. And so extended periods of time during flowering of cloudiness and then with the precipitation lend themselves to the potential for ear rots as well. So sometimes there can be a double whammy when we run into this same kind of environment that we're speaking about. Now, it's not typically that severe, but you can oftentimes see a yield reduction because of the shading effect that Ben's spoken about this morning. But also, you can also get that double whammy because you've got that moisture and you can be more susceptible to some of the ear rots because of that moist time. The disease is readily available, traveling down the silks, many of the things we've talked about before. That's not always the case, but I do think it's worth mentioning that sometimes this can really set you up for some real issues later on down the road when we have those kind of conditions just right there at VT and R1.
And it's entirely possible, Brian, that we could have 3 to 5 days of mostly cloudy weather or even rain around a pollination window that,
Yeah.
3 to 5 days, if we're hot, could cover it and it'd be
Yeah.
done. I mean, so you could
Yep.
have, this is an extreme example is what I'm pointing
Yes.
out, but it's not entirely impossible for us to actually see something like that in the field.
Brian, I guess I'll add in, you and Ben both had referred to the importance of having high quality sunlight during that, that pollination process. And as we consider the impact of stresses on the crop vegetatively, it's pretty rare, right, that it has a significant yield impact. And the whole concept there is when you're going through vegetative growth, we are assembling the parts for that photosynthetic factory. And so as long as the parts are there, as long as we built the factory, as long as we can flip the switch on and get going when it's time to actually build yield, build the reproductive structures of the corn plant or soybean plant, that's what matters. And so if we undergo stress prior to it in the vegetative stages, it's not that big of an impact because we're just building the factory. It's when we need the factory to be up and running and we have the stresses is when we slow down that assembly line and we slow down the amount of yield that we're building in that factory. So that'd be one thought that kind of dovetails with the conversation. And Ben, you look like you might have something to share on that front.
Well, I was gonna pivot a little bit and bring up that it's also one of the reasons why we talk about uniformity in corn so much, and being able to capture the most sunlight the most efficiently with the entire canopy. It's tempting to think about managing an individual plant, but that's really not what you're doing. And if you think about leaf area, the amount of ground that the total leaf of that canopy covers, it takes somewhere between 4 and 7 times the leaf area to get near 100% of solar radiation capture. So it also comes into play when we think, one, let's make sure we have a most uniform stand we can get. We'll make the good planting decisions, but understanding, and Brian's going to love it when I say this, how things compound throughout the season. That if you look at this last June and how slow things grew and how slow corn was to canopy and how small some of our corn plants were, I am sure that they were below that 4 threshold to be at maximum efficiency or be close to maximum efficiency from capturing solar radiation. And fortunately, we had a pretty good August. Like grain fill from a solar radiation standpoint wasn't too bad. Right? So I think that helped out. We had more sunlight than what we usually would because we had less canopy than what would be ideal to try and intercept. If we had some decreased sunlight that could stack on top of each other. But I'm not explaining that very well, but it's a lot of words to say that, man, it's a complicated system, and we try to think about all these things in isolation, and they don't occur that way throughout a growing season.
Well, and just to that point, right, in beans, same concept, why we often see 15-inch row beans be successful as a production system is that they close the row faster, they reach canopy more quickly. So you're shading out weeds from a competition standpoint, but you're more efficiently harvesting all that sunlight because it's not hitting the ground. In 30s versus 15s, it can take 20, 25 days, in terms of the difference of 30-inch row beans closing the canopy versus 15-inch row beans just planted in the field next door. So I think that idea of, light interception and the leaf area index, it's one of those principles of agronomy that you learn a lot about in a classroom setting or a textbook, but we don't talk about a whole lot in the applied sense. But that's part of the fundamentals, if you will, the foundation of why we raise crops the way that we do.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, Ben, this is a very nuanced conversation with lots of parts. You have the leaf area index, we have the amount of shading, but you've also got, you've got basically photosynthetically active radiation. I mean, you've got certain quality of sunlight. It's not just the amount, it's the quality as well. And all of these things. I mean, we've obviously got folks within the organization that spend the majority of their time trying to figure out how to make a better mousetrap, meaning they're actually looking at plant architecture in order to optimize the leaf area index to capture as much light as they can. I mean, that upright hybrid that Pioneer is well known for, that doesn't happen necessarily completely by accident. Certainly there's some genetics that play into that, but that's been somewhat created by our breeders over the year because it's an incredibly efficient way to capture sunlight as well, compared to some of the competition. To your point around soybeans versus corn, Carl, soybeans obviously move to fill that space in. That's not really how a corn plant operates. During the day, we've all seen that as the sun goes across the sky, the soybeans, will position leaves and fill gaps and things like that. That's not the way the corn plant operates. And so there's some differences there as well, just crop to crop, species to species, that you have to take into consideration as well. And then you get into, and I certainly am not the person to do this, but you get into how the plant actually photosynthesizes and what actually goes on in the cells of the plant in order to capture sunlight and do the ATP conversion and all of those things to build the machine, as we often talk about it. And that's another part of that this quality and quantity metrics go into. That's the direct impact of this yield that we're talking about, Ben.
There's been a fair amount of interest here over the last couple of years, and it's not new work. The kernel orientation studies and things of that nature, and all of that is designed to optimize, the corn plant so that its leaf structures are perpendicular to the row. That way, you're getting the most leaves per area, in that sense, to capture the sunlight. I guess I'd be interested to see how practical that is when the technology does reach that. We do talk about, and this is offhand, I don't know if it's like a 10 or 15% increase in yield. Perhaps that's maybe being a little generous, but I question it a little bit, right? Because when you randomly have kernels placed in the seed trench, in different orientations, as you walk corn, you don't see leaves that are all of a sudden parallel with the row. They still wind up finding their way to the row centers because they're actively trying to reach and search for that light in the most optimal way. So you just think about how a plant survives. It's got to condition itself to reach the resources it needs. So roots grow deeper to get water, and plants move their leaves to seek sunlight. And really cool from that standpoint. So
Brian, we talked about beans just a little bit, and longtime listeners will know that, and I think this shifts probably a little bit. And in fact, I believe Dr. Castile brought this up as well. But when we had him on, but listen, that August makes beans, right? Now that's probably up through September 15th. And when I go back and try and dissect, what made bean yields so good, or what made bean yields off, often it comes down to, and there's a 4-week window there during pod fill. Did we have adequate solar radiation or did we not? And you think back to last year, September 1st, we were getting pretty dry in a lot of areas of the state. And a lot of areas had really, really good beans. I think most of the state probably had really, really good beans, and much better than what would have been expected at some point. And, what that boils down to is we had enough sunlight to retain more seeds as we were going through pod fill. Now, I think what folks will think of most often with solar radiation with beans is the summer solstice and its impact that it's going to have on when they start flowering, which actually, if I can be a nerd for a second, is not a function of day length. That's driven by night length, but that's really, really splitting hairs there, isn't it? But that's what drives the planting date response to beans largely, is that we talk about it in terms of flower initiation. Can we start flowering earlier? And yes, you can impact that earlier, but the reason you can is for the reasons that you all have already mentioned, is that we've built a bigger factory. We're harvesting more photosynthate. Right? You have the energy in the plant to support that reproductive development. At that point, there is, of course, the physiological component of the night length that you can't escape completely, but you can manipulate it if you build the factory right.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe a couple things to add on to what Ben's sharing there. The response to earlier planting dates. It's soybeans don't start flowering on the summer solstice because they realize, boom, this is the longest day. It's going to start getting shorter, or the nights are about to get longer on me. There is a thermal component to beans that drive some of the anatomical processes that lead to new structures in the plant. So the idea to optimize bean yields is you want them to be reproducing, flowering, building those components of yields when you have the most resources. So instead of starting to flower at the summer solstice when you're at the peak day length, you want to shift that to, hey, how can I capture as much sunlight throughout the season? And that means flowering prior to the summer solstice because you have more longer days available to yourself there. So that's kind of the concept. But Brian, do you have something to add?
The only thing that I thought about was Ben said a few minutes ago that, in terms of how we as agronomists and as growers can impact quality of sunlight, the amount of solar radiation, all those things, there's not a whole lot, but I am struck by this conversation about soybeans around whether or how much population could potentially play into that being some level of impact that we can have on this in order to not overcrowd, to fill all the space. I've talked to you guys, we've talked on the podcast a handful of times about this idea of potentially nodes per acre for soybeans rather than plants per acre. I guess I'm just curious, as we're kind of playing around with this idea, is there merit to us being able to impact solar radiation with population? And if so, does that really change anything, Ben, that you and I talked about when we talked about soybean population a couple weeks ago? And then I'll add into that, does population on corn have much of an impact, just because the thermal part of this conversation around corn and because of the way that the plant's structured?
I'd answer your question with a question, Brian, to the listeners. How many times have you had beans and they need thickening up, right? We leave the existing stand, you go back and you seed some more. Usually you've got first true leaves out there, so you're a few weeks behind. And then you come back at the end of the season. If you do, check out those plants. If you seeded it at an angle, are they loaded up with pods? Or are they mostly stems and leaves? Oftentimes they're mostly stems and leaves because they got outcompeted by the neighbors that were already established. And so in that vein, no, we're not necessarily adding yield by adding those extra nodes per acre, but we sure as heck are protecting yield by allowing the beans to compete with beans, as opposed to establishing more water hemp and more pernicious plants that are going to make it a headache to manage in the future. So I guess that's something that I think of when you come to replant decisions, plant spacing, seeding rates, it all in relation to photosynthesis and the availability of sunlight. But there's plenty of meat on the bone yet.
Well, Brian, I don't think that it changes really anything that you and I talked about here, whenever it was last week or the week before that we talked about soybean seeding rates. And I do think that, yes, we have an achievable yield with probably a population that's lower than what we want to, from the standpoint of the risk that it exposes us to when we run into adverse conditions. So, much the same in that situation. I'm still a big proponent of let's keep our seeding rates reasonably high. Now, there could be some discussion around row spacing. Carl mentioned 15s earlier. There have been some really good beans grown in 30-inch rows that are definitely going to take longer to canopy. But typically the populations hang out roughly the same as they do when they're switched to 15. So keep your bean populations adequate. We know we're gonna have a high level of attrition. And the other thing we know, especially as you live where we do in the Eastern Corn Belt, is that we are not going to have as much solar radiation as we want in a growing season. We're just not. As you go west, you can get where the majority of the growing season is going to be full sun, and you'll have all the solar radiation you want. It's going to rain here. It's going to be hazy. It's going to be overcast. The timing of that has a big impact on the crop, but it's another thing. We talk about stresses all the time. It's a stress. We don't know exactly when it's going to come or how bad it's going to be, but we know we're going to have it every single year. And hopefully we can avoid these long stretches where we have, 10 days, 2 weeks of 50% overcast throughout. And we will rarely see an impact from it if that's the case, if it's broken up with quick little individual stressors.
It's the balancing of the scales, right? Out west, you have really high quality sunlight because you don't have cloud cover, because you don't have rain. And that's where their dry land yields really suffer because water is the most limiting resource. Here, we have adequate or an overabundance in supply of clouds and rain, and therefore we have a deficit in sunlight, and that's what keeps our yields governed. So it all comes down to the balancing of those resources, and if you can optimize them, which we have no control over how much sunlight, that's where you see really bin busting yields come together for you.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things that are worth mentioning here. Number one, I think, Ben, to your point, it's coming. We know that there will be times when we won't have adequate sunlight. It's just a good reminder that when things are good, we need to take care of our crop as best we can, because we know healthy plants are going to withstand stress, regardless of what it is: drought stress, moisture stress, lack of sunlight, whatever. A healthier plant is going to do better in those stresses. It goes back to what we talk about all the time with these compounding stresses. I think the other thing that I think we have to talk about, or at least I think we have to mention as well, is that while we're not going to be able to do anything about this, knowing how it impacts our crop helps us when we get to the fall, to your point, Carl, to know why we ended up with the yields that we ended up with. We can go back and we can look at this and we can chart these things and be able to say, hey, you know what, here's a dip in solar radiation for 2 weeks that we didn't expect, that is different than the 30-year norm or 30-year average. There has to have been some impact on that. And that it keeps us better informed when we go back and look at the growing season in retrospect.
Yeah, really nice tool.
Yeah. I think, Brian, would probably be remiss if we didn't mention the role that the breeding organization plays in this,
Sure.
This broadly. When I think about one huge differentiator from basically our entire corn lineup to anybody else in the industry is that we've for probably generations prioritize late season plant health, stay green score in it. And in a year with all the sunlight you could ever want, that may not make a difference, but it is something that helps that plant be more resilient and have the ability to keep packing on photosynthesis all the way through grain fill, all the way through that dry matter accumulation. And the other thing that I think about is, we've had Don Kyle and Charlie Zilla on several times, and if you're walking, it really stands out in research plots, but if you're walking side by sides with a competitor brand in it in the bean field, you can see it as well. As our beans start to flower earlier if you're comparing maturity to maturity, they initiate flowering. Generally speaking, I'm not saying every variety is going to do it, but generally speaking, they initiate flowers earlier than other brands do, right? From a different germplasm set, and that has a real impact on yield. But we also know that there's a really high rate of attrition in soybean flowers, and we're going to lose a lot of them. So even if it's just 5 days, if you're adding another 3, 4, 5 flowers per plant at your 140,000 plants, ideally, that adds up over time, right? If you're going to lose 80% of those, that's a big difference in harvestable pods. So I didn't want us to escape this conversation without giving the breeding organization their flowers for the role that they play and help, because it's about as impactful as anything that we can manage to do in the field as well.
For sure. And like I said before, we've got folks that they're looking at flowering length. They're looking at plant architecture. Those are all parts of the breeding organization and what they're doing in order to get us the absolute best products that perform the best in the field. So yes, I agree, Ben, with that. We absolutely had to mention that. So, one other item I do want to mention at least is if you are working with your Pioneer sales rep, your Pioneer sales rep does actually have the ability to look at solar radiation. We have a tool that every sales rep has access to that they use for plot and data collection that internally is referred to as MTDE, and they can pull up their own plot location if they have entered it, and you can see solar radiation, and you can also compare that to, I believe, the 30-year historical average for radiation. And so if you're somebody that's listening today and you're really fired up about knowing where solar radiation is, I'd encourage you to talk to your sales rep, have them take a look at the location reports in that tool, and they will be able to look at solar radiation. And so I wanted to at least mention that because it is available and can be gotten to by Pioneer sales reps. So, anything else on solar radiation or photosynthesis or anything that we haven't really covered? I don't know that we've given anybody anything necessarily actionable beyond the fact that it is able to be monitored, and it is something we, at least at the end of the season, need to keep track of. But anything else, guys, that we haven't touched on yet today that we should?
Well, Brian, maybe I'll pin down a point and then go into another subject that's a tool for growers in this spirit. Pinning down the point that Ben was talking about, that late season plant health. If you have a disease, a leaf with a bunch of lesions on it, it's a dusty solar panel. It can't harvest the same amount of sunlight. And then that is the concept, is that the cleaner we can keep our fields, the better, the more efficient they can be at capturing the sunlight and like Ben said, moving those photosynthates into the reproductive structures. And so I would say in a year where you have all the sunlight you could need in the world, oftentimes you see later maturity hybrids perform better because they're alive longer where you have all that sunlight, right? As long as you have those resources, you can keep on growing and you can keep on reproducing. And so when you think about the differentiation between Pioneer and another brand, if you have the same maturity product, but one is a die and dry, that means it's dying and it's not capturing that sunlight as you go into, the later stages of grain fill. But if you have one that's healthy up until that black layer period, that means that we've packed it full of all the starches and we've really optimized and maximized the yield potential there. So just wanted to, it might have been a little bit of a Captain Obvious statement, but felt like it was worth at least pinning down a little bit further. And then if you'd be willing to indulge a total nerd moment here, talking about the measuring of sunlight.
Yep.
Plants, they absorb blue light and a lot of red light, and then they're green because they reflect the wavelengths that are green light, right? So that's just a fun one you can explain to your kids or people in town that don't understand why we do what we do in the farming world. But where it's practical and applied is that when you look at tools like NDVI, right, the near differentiated vegetative index, what you're actually comparing there is the reflection of near infrared light. And so that's getting further along the wavelength spectrum after red. We can't see it with our eyes, but it's light that plants use. And a really healthy leaf is going to be one, if I got this right, is going to be one that's going to reflect more of that near infrared, but then a plant that is stressed, whether it's due to, pest, disease, nutrient deficiencies, it's going to reflect less near infrared light. So the concept there is we're measuring the difference between those two, and that's how you see these maps built in a field. And that's how you're practically using this stuff that we're talking about when it comes to solar radiation and how we can actually use it to drive decisions. And one day you may see that some of the, we'll call NDVIs, quote unquote, satellite imagery, perhaps you could use that to make decisions on seeding rates, right? The NDVI concept is that where you've got more healthy parts of the field, they're probably going to be your higher yielding parts of the field. Well, will we manage the higher yielding part of the field differently than the poorer yielding part of the field? Is it consistently year in and year out a healthier, a higher yielding spot in the field? Then we can drive decisions and scale them and automate them, as opposed to, being a blunt force, to ram some of those types of prescriptions and things of that nature. So again, getting a little bit down a bunny trail there, but I think one last piece to this whole puzzle of light, solar radiation, that was very timely after we're coming off of the cool solar eclipse moment.
Sure. No, definitely so. So guys, I think that probably can put a bow in this conversation. Certainly, as I mentioned before, we talked about it quite a bit last summer in terms of the impact that the haze and the wildfires had. We've certainly circled back around on that a couple times and talked about perhaps not nearly the effect that we thought. And so, Ben started out as we were talking today, talking about those 70% cloths. That's a pretty extreme case. And so we're really talking about some pretty nuanced things. You're not going to typically expect to see several weeks of this kind of situation. And so we will link both of the Pioneer articles that talk about solar radiation in the show notes for folks that are really interested in digging into this a little bit more. And so with that, guys, if someone heard something today that they would like to discuss with you in a little bit more detail, Ben, how could they get a hold of you?
Yep, you can find me on X at @BenJacob and occasionally on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Carl?
You can, same places, different faces, on X at Joern, that's CJOERN, and on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. Brian Shrader, how about yourself?
Yep, a little bit different for me. You can find me on Instagram at B_K_Schrader. And so with that, we'll call it an episode. We thank you for joining us on this episode of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. Like always, if you've got any feedback for us, please reach out to us on one of those social media platforms. If you've got a topic that you're very interested in and you'd like us to take on and at least discuss a little bit, please let us know that as well. Until next time, hope you're safe out there, and we'll see you next week on the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.